Hello, and welcome to this second lecture of 3 lectures on the ethics of aid and development. If you remember, in the first lecture I outlined a number of the positive arguments for giving aid, both by individuals and by other groups like states. But this time I'm going to look at a number of objections that are given to aid and then indicate why I think we can reply to those objections. As you can expect, I don't think they're good objections, but one certainly meets them from time to time, and if one knows what they are and how to answer them, then that gives one a little bit of strength to one's elbow, as it were. So now I'm going to turn to these arguments. So first of all, I'm going to give you a kind of summary of what I think the 3 arguments, the 3 kinds of arguments are that one meets. As I said, they fall into 3 broad categories. The first broad category is like this. Some people think that we don't have any general duty to give aid to help alleviate poverty in another country because there's no general duty to do so even in one's own society. In other words, some people have a certain conception of morality and what morality requires of us that does not include a general duty to help others. So that's the first kind of objection. It's an objection to helping one another anyway, wherever people are. The second objection is this. It's rather different. It says, well, whilst it may be a feature of an ethical code that people have, that one does have general duties to help others who need help, this only applies to one's own society. These moral obligations belong to one's own society, not to the world as a whole. Because we don't, according to this argument, live, ethically speaking, in a global society or community at all. We live in lots of separate societies in the world, and so our obligations are to one another in one's own society, but we don't really have the same kind of obligations towards people everywhere else in the world, or if we do, it's in some very weak or attenuated sense that we have obligations to anyone outside our society. This I'm going to call the communitarian conception of morality. But the third kind of argument, which is the one you're probably more familiar with if you've thought about these issues at all, is this. The giving of transboundary aid is in one way or another inappropriate. It's not the right kind of thing to be doing. Why might one think that it's inappropriate? Well, actually, there are an awful lot of different kinds of reasons given for thinking that aid might be inappropriate. Now, I'm first of all just going to outline them for you, and then having outlined them, we can look at these arguments in slightly more detail and consider what's wrong with them. The first argument is basically, in a nutshell, aid doesn't, generally speaking, work. It's counterproductive. The empirical record of aid projects, whether by governments or by charities, is a dismal catalogue of failures. For one reason or another, aid just doesn't do the good that it's expected to do. And if it doesn't do the good it's expected to do, there's no obligation to do it, because otherwise it would be pointless. And this claim that aid doesn't generally work is often backed by a number of more complicated considerations which tend to explain why this is so, that it doesn't work. I'm not going to go through all these. You'll find I go into these in much more detail in the second reading that's been given, which not only considers some of the positive arguments I considered last time, but goes into rather more detail into these arguments I'm considering now. So if you're intrigued by it, you can pursue it further through that paper. Anyway, these further considerations include the following thoughts. Aid, it might be said, cannot work. It doesn't. It's not just the case that it doesn't work. It cannot work because aid is by its nature something that creates dependency. And genuine development, or what really helps the poor, reduces dependency and encourages autonomy. And since any genuine development has the effect of making poor people less dependent and more autonomous, then aid is counterproductive because it creates dependency. So that's the second kind of argument. The third kind of argument is drawn from an ecological perspective, because it's argued that aid is disastrous because it keeps more people alive, and if more people are kept alive, then this puts strains on the ecological carrying capacity areas of the world, and in the end on the world as a whole. And there's a lot more suffering from absolute poverty in the future because people who are kept alive will suffer later from extreme poverty anyway. That's the third argument. The fourth argument is that focusing on aid as though that's the thing we ought to do is actually an inappropriate distraction from what the real challenges are that face us in the world. Because what we really ought to be focusing on is reforming the whole international economic system. Aid just tinkers at the edges of what's really a whole system which itself has major effects on the existence and extent of world poverty. So, let's say the fourth argument is that aid, in a sense, is an inappropriate distraction from the real challenges. Finally, in this list I'm giving you today, aid, it is often claimed, is generally compromised. Because, for instance, when we look at the means taken in the pursuit of aid, or indeed look at the further objectives involved in aid, these are often ethically troubling or dubious. There are, for instance, and I'm sure you've heard this one before, further foreign policy agendas in official aid. Countries are pursuing political foreign policy objectives in their aid programs rather than purely helping other countries. And generally speaking, sometimes it's explicit, sometimes it's more subtle, aid comes with conditions attached. And these conditions attached are often called tied aid or conditionalities. And the argument is that if aid is tied or has conditionalities attached to it, then it's ethically problematic. But not just that. Generally speaking, when aid is given, and when aid is given by countries or whether it's given by NGO charities, the same point can be made that aid generally comes with further ethical and political religious objectives or assumptions. What we're trying to do is to spread certain values in giving aid. And these values may be what we call cultural imperialism, trying to spread from one culture values which are not really appropriate to other cultures. So I've given you here in a quick summary form a number of the more common arguments why aid is seen as inappropriate. So to recap, the three basic difficulties about the ethics of aid. First of all, a person may not accept any general duty to help one another. Secondly, they may think that general duty only applies to your own society, not the world as a whole. And third, the argument that aid doesn't work in one way or another, or is inappropriate in some way or other. So let's now look at all this in a little bit more detail. So let's first of all look at the argument that there's no general duty to help others in one's own society, even let alone in the world as a whole. Now, this approach to morality is sometimes called a minimalist approach to morality. What is stressed here by those who believe in morality, and they are believing in morality, they're not just selfish egoists. A minimal approach to morality says this: we do have duties to one another in our society, and to human beings generally, but these are duties not to harm one another or violate the rights of one another. It's not a general duty to help or promote the rights of others. And so this duty not to harm or violate the rights of others is the central essence of morality, that we don't, as it were, act negatively towards others. And of course, it's true that if everyone did follow duties not to harm or violate one another's rights, then indeed most people will get on pretty well most of the time. It's not an absurd idea of morality, and if it was followed properly, it would lead generally to good results. But the point here being making is that this is seen as the essence of morality, a duty not to harm one another. What is resisted is the idea that we have some kind of general duty to going around helping other people all the time or promoting the rights of other people all the time. Now, just in case you think this is a very strange view, I should point out that this approach, which I say is sometimes called ethical minimalism, does accept that, of course, we will have special duties to particular other people. For instance, we'll have special duties to our family. We'll have special duties to our friends, because we've formed friends, and friendship involves special obligations towards one another. And we'll also have special duties if we enter into contracts or agreements. If I agree to look after your children for the afternoon, then I have an obligation to look after your children, and so on. So there are duties around to help one another, but they are duties which are special, relating to special circumstances, not generalized. And incidentally, and we'll have more to say about this later in the third lecture, incidentally, this approach is often linked nowadays with a view called libertarianism. The view that what's at the center of morality is people's liberty to do whatever they will. The only constraint on people's liberty to do what they will is that they mustn't undermine or seriously affect the liberty of others in so doing. And this makes this account of libertarianism is actually quite popular, particularly in the economic sphere. And I say we'll come back to that when we look at Amartya Sen in the third lecture. Now, I haven't much time in this brief lecture to go into detail by way of reply, but let me just mention in each case a number of difficulties I feel are here. It seems to me there are at least these two problems with this view of morality and what morality requires of us. First of all, it seems to me it's too individualistic. It doesn't take seriously enough the idea that human beings as moral beings are beings who are related to one another in community or society, and being related to one another in a community or society is precisely to have not merely negative obligations but positive obligations to pull together and help one another and to operate in that way. So I think it's too individualistic a conception of morality. But secondly, it seems to me it fails the test that we considered last time in connection with the arguments for giving aid, and that is the would you want to be helped test. Surely we all would want to be helped if we were in trouble, and since we would all want to be helped if we were in trouble, surely we should accept ethically that it's reasonable for others to want us to help, and that this is the basis of morality, this sense of mutual reciprocity and helping one another, because that's what we'd all want each other to do to each other. So if we accept do unto others as you would be done unto yourself, that doesn't quite fit this minimalist morality approach. Okay, that's the first general objection to aid, which I think can be replied to fairly quickly. Let's now look at the next one, which is slightly more complicated. And this is the claim that the duty to help one another only really applies, or applies primarily, to one's own society. As I said a few minutes ago, this is what is called a communitarian conception of morality. And there are all sorts of similar theories in ethics to do with contract and convention and so on, which often make the similar point in slightly different ways, that our obligations depend on things like shared traditions, shared social institutions, and active reciprocity one with another. And if you accept this conception of morality, then it seems clear that the obligations we have are to people in our own community. And so they're not really to people lying outside our community. Because although we often talk about the world being a community, a global community, it isn't really a community in the sense, the strong sense, in which people belonging within to one another within a community or their own society clearly are part of a community in a stronger sense. Well, this is a very strong, significant, and popular approach. Communitarians sometimes present their views in a slightly strong manner. But let me see what's wrong with this. In a way, I can't give you a definite answer against this argument if people are persuaded by it, but I do want to stress that the ethical arguments for aid that we've considered before do involve a rather different conception of morality from this, in that they accept, first of all, the claim that all human beings do matter and matter equally, but more significantly, they do accept that our obligations towards one another do not depend on these above factors of shared tradition, shared social institutions, or reciprocity, but more on the capacity to affect them. In other words, if we accept that human beings can do well and suffer and do badly, and that we think it's bad that people suffer, and if we accept that our actions, or for that matter inactions, can negatively affect the well-being of other people, then one very natural way of understanding the impulse of morality is to say, given that I can affect them, I ought not, unless there are good reason to do so, affect them in a negative way, that is, to cause them not to do well. All I can offer you is my basic understanding of what the expectation of morality is all about, that it requires us to consider the well-being of others as potentially of relevance to us if our actions can affect their well-being in one way or another. So I say this conception of morality, which I commend to you, is one that makes our obligations dependent on the capacity to affect people, not on the shared traditions or shared social institutions that communitarian tends to stress. Well, that's not a direct argument that disproves communitarianism, but it's an alternative conception which seems to me make better sense of what morality is about. And it's really, basically, cosmopolitanism. The arguments which we looked at in the last lecture, cosmopolitanism comes from two Greek words, kosmos polites, which mean literally citizens of the universe, but is generally understood as citizen of the world, or global citizen. And I see myself as a cosmopolitan and commend it to you as an approach. Many of you may actually be cosmopolitans without even realizing it, but I hope you'll recognize the perspective in what I say. And one of the recent well-known cosmopolitans called Thomas Pogge, in his book World Poverty and Human Rights, gives this characterization of cosmopolitanism. It's on your page here. First, he says, individualism. The three elements are these. First, individualism. The ultimate units of concern are human beings or persons, rather than, say, family lines, tribes, ethnic, cultural, religious communities, nations, or states. Second, universality. The status of ultimate unit of concern attaches to every living human being equally, not merely to some subset, such as men, aristocrats, Aryans, whites, or Muslims. Third, generality. This special status has global force. Persons are ultimate units of concern for everyone, not only for their compatriots, fellow religionists, or such like. Now, I think this gives us a pretty good feel of the cosmopolitan approach and why, if we accept it, we will recognize that in principle we do have obligations to respond to problems of world poverty. It's saying that the ultimate unit of concern are human beings as such, as individuals. Secondly, universality, all human beings are equal. And thirdly, and this is a term that is less obvious when you first hear it, I'm not sure why he used it, but it's the word generality, which he takes to mean that if we accept all human beings have equal status, then that has global force. That is, it has a bearing on what any of us in the world ought to be doing. So persons are the ultimate unit of concern for everyone, and this is the concept which I talked about last time of transboundary or transnational or transsocietal obligations which we might have towards one another. Now, there are a whole lot of issues we haven't time to go into here, and I briefly raised last time about how much obligation we have, but in principle the perspective is, as I've indicated, the cosmopolitan perspective, that we do have obligations towards one another across boundaries. Okay, well, those are the two first kinds of arguments against aid and the kind of replies I think one needs to give. Let's now look at the argument that aid is inappropriate. or arguments, because there are various ones. The first argument, as I said before, is that aid doesn't generally work. The empirical record is a dismal catalogue of failures. And there may be various reasons given why aid fails. It might be the technology isn't appropriate to the local setting, or there may be a lack of appropriate skills training. A classic story, which you may have heard of, early aid programs where tractors would be delivered for local people to improve their agriculture, but no effort was made properly to train local people how to use the tractors, or more to the point, to maintain them, so that within a short time after the aid project had left, the tractors simply rusted in the field because no one knew how to keep them going. That's a classic example. Another kind of problem is that maybe the aid programs are not sufficiently sensitive to local traditions and cultures. They try and impose things which are not relevant to or appropriate to a local culture. And this might include religious values. In fact, there's a lot of interest now in the relevance of local religious values to the effectiveness of aid, for those who believe it can be done. But clearly there are problems here. One particular example, I remember when I was visiting an aid worker in Botswana in the 80s, was that he developed the modern version of a hay box for slow cooking, which was a polystyrene box. And he went to the villagers to try and get them to accept this as a much better way of cooking than using firewood, which is in scarce supply in Botswana. But the project completely failed, and for the reason why women like to have a fire with wood on it to cook their meals was that the fire was a focal point for the social get-together, and you don't feel particularly like a social get-together around a plastic box. So that was just another simple example of how an aid program was simply not geared to what local people really wanted. Anyway, all sorts of arguments could be given there, and I'm sure you can think of others that you've met. But my general reply to this argument that aid doesn't work is that, of course, some aid doesn't work. Some forms of aid, on the other hand, does work. We can't, as it were, tar all aid with the same brush. So if one thinks that, of course, some aid doesn't work, but other aid does work, then the argument must be that people ought to support those kinds of aid that do work. This will require a bit more homework, being clear about what aid projects are more successful than others. But to just dismiss all aid as not working is a ridiculous approach, I think. And incidentally, there's a rather, well, there are two books with slightly different titles, but they're saying the same issue, by someone called Roger Riddell, R-I-D-D-E-L-L, on the kind of record of aid, and he argues in those books, one of them's called Foreign Aid Reconsidered, that yes, some aid hasn't worked, but many aid projects clearly do work. So if you do your homework, you can discover plenty of aid programs that do work. But I now want to look at one or two of the more specific kind of arguments that sometimes surface. A common argument, which was particularly associated with an aid critic called Peter Bauer, B-A-U-E-R, in a book called Reality and Rhetoric, and elsewhere. And he and others have argued that aid cannot work because aid by its nature creates dependency. If you go on giving aid to people, they just become dependent on your aid, and that is completely contrary to what development should really be about. And I think that's a fair point. In fact, all these arguments against aid have a limited point, but they're not as effective as a general argument, as my general strategy. Clearly, aid programs do create dependency, and insofar as they create dependency, they're not terribly satisfactory, because we can accept that a good aid project is one which does exactly the reverse. It enables poorer people to have more control over their lives and to be more autonomous. But it seems to me a strange strategy to argue that aid as helping as such does this, because helping as such does not create dependency. Let me give an example. Supposing your car's broken down on the side of the road on a cold night in winter, or for that matter, extremely hot night, and you can't repair your car. Are we arguing that another motorist should not stop to help you either get your car going or take you to a safe place? Clearly, such helping doesn't create dependency. Of course, the driver needing help is dependent on your help at that moment, but it doesn't create dependency. That's quite different. And so it all depends on the kind of aid that's given. And the point that I think Dower and others were particularly concerned about was that a lot of aid, particularly in the early years, was aid in response to emergencies, to food shortages and so on, where aid consisted in the delivery of food and water and other commodities. And of course, if that's the only kind of aid given, then it's not surprising that people will become dependent on that aid being given, just as in other countries, very poor people on the streets get used to a pattern of depending on aid being given to them. So if aid is only the giving of short-term assistance in the form of food or whatever, then of course, if that becomes the standard pattern, then it does create dependency. But few people would argue that that kind of aid is the only way aid should be given. As I said at the beginning of the first lecture, that kind of aid is vital in emergencies, but it's not the right kind of response as a long-term solution to problems. So if aid, on the other hand, is, as is to use a phrase that's commonly used now, a form of capacity building, it enables poorer people to acquire greater skills and greater resources and greater opportunities for doing well for themselves, then that is anything but dependency creating. So the argument is that aid needs to be balanced. We need both kinds of aid, and if we stress the second kind of aid, often called development assistance or capacity building, then it seems to me it gets around this objection. Let's now look at the third objection from an ecological perspective. The argument is that aid is disastrous since it keeps more people alive, and this puts more pressure on the environment, and so on and so forth. Garrett Hardin, an American ecologist, was famous and notorious for pushing this line of thought in papers like The Case Against Helping the Poor. And he very much did argue that, that if you basically feed the poor, you keep them alive, you create more and more people. There's a kind of population pressure argument here. And in any case, if they remain poor, then another crisis will come, and they and their children will also need handouts, and so the extreme poverty carries on. This was quite a striking line of thought some years ago, and engendered a lot of replies. But I think it can be generally conceded, again, as we said last time, that if we focus on emergency aid alone, he may well be right. That is, if all we do is to provide food to keep people alive, but they remain in the conditions in which they cannot do well for themselves, then indeed people may continue to be very poor, and if they have children, then their children may be in the same situation. But of course, as we've seen before, development assistance does not have this effect. People may help themselves as a result of it. But still, you might say, isn't there an argument that the more people there are kept alive, the more pressures there are on the environment, and this is a problem in the long run? Well, I think there is a problem in the long run about increasing human populations, but that's another lecture. But I think one of the key points to be recognized here is what is often called the demographic transition argument. And this argument is to the effect that if appropriate development occurs, if people are help themselves, and if there are appropriate public services, for instance, access to healthcare, other kinds of social services, and so on, then there's a lot of evidence that fertility goes down. Once poor people have more confidence that the children they give birth to will survive them and therefore help them in their old age, then they are less likely to want to have very large families. So in fact, appropriate aid will help reduce that population expansion. And so, again, that seems to be an argument to a line of thought that I say many people with a particular kind of ecological perspective are worried about. Right, well, let's now turn to the fourth argument. The fourth argument is that if we focus on aid, this is an inappropriate distraction from the real challenges, because the real focus should be on changing the whole international economic system. We touched on it last time, and as I said then, Thomas Pogge is one of the writers who is interested in this issue, but many others are. I mean, many people would argue over the years that if you look at the terms of trade between rich countries and poor countries, they're often in the favor of the rich countries. Rich countries often have protectionist measures like the Common Agricultural Policy in Europe, which, as it were, prevents imports coming in which would help poorer people who grow them. And more recently, a lot of attention is being paid to intellectual property rights, so-called TRIPS agreements and patents, which often advantage very rich countries, multinational pharmaceutical companies, and as it were, make it more difficult for very poor people to do at all well. For instance, because the seeds they used to have are now being patented, and so they have to pay to get them. There's a whole big complicated set of issues there. Again, there's a whole question of tax havens where rich individuals and companies are able to keep their profits and they're not properly taxed, and so on and so forth. There's a whole issue about international debt and how international debt just grinds the poor down, because the debt in poor countries may have been incurred by countries' governments, often non-democratic governments, but who suffers from the repayment of debts are very poor people in those countries. So there's arguments for altering the whole way we think about international debt. So this is a whole big field, as you can tell, in which many would argue, and I think with some degree of rightness, that there ought to be a lot of major changes to the whole way the international economic and international system works. And that this would have far bigger impacts on the reduction of poverty than aid programs alone. However, I would resist the reason for saying aid isn't something we should focus on, because I want to argue, as you might expect, that we need both approaches. We need both to look at effective aid, but also to look at ways in which the whole international system can be improved in favor of the poorer countries and indeed poor people within them. There's a story I heard ages ago from a prominent internationalist called John Ferguson, where he talked about two British figures in the 19th century, William Morris and Rossetti the artist. And it's probably apocryphal, but anyway, the story goes that whenever they passed a beggar in the streets, Rossetti, who was a very emotional type of person, would empty his pockets of all the cash he had, but William Morris would walk by and would never give a penny to a beggar. On the other hand, William Morris spent a lot of his efforts campaigning to change institutions and laws and attitudes so that there would be less poor people on the streets. But that wasn't something Rossetti did at all. And the argument he was giving, which I entirely accept and commend to you, is that both are needed. Both kinds of response are needed. And indeed, I would argue, using the framework I gave in the last lecture, that the moral arguments for responding to need now, as Rossetti did, and the moral arguments for structural change, as William Morris was concerned with, are at root the same moral arguments. But this is a big issue. But whether or not they're the same moral arguments, as I would argue, it seems to me that we need both responses. And so, although it is indeed a mistake to focus on aid as the only thing that involves our responsibilities towards the world, it doesn't mean we shouldn't focus on aid at all. Finally, in this survey, what about the argument that aid is generally ethically compromised? The fact of the matter is that aid is often an arm of foreign policy. Aid is often given to create and maintain spheres of influence in countries that we want to be favorable to us. And clearly, tied aid, or conditionality, is linked to goods and services of donor countries. And aid can be the projection of the donor countries' or organizations' values. The reply that we have to give to this is that, yes, this is quite often the case. But is it always the case, or even usually the case? And even if it is, we have to ask ourselves this question. So long as they does have good, does the presence either mixed or emotive validate? The fact of the matter is that most of us who do good things towards one another aren't merely helping one another for altruistic reasons. We may have other reasons for helping one another, or there may be further reasons lying behind it. So long as those other motives do not distort what is done or produce results which are bad for other people, it may well be we have to accept a certain level of mixed or ulterior motives. And this is going to apply to countries' aid programs as well as to individuals. And finally, is conditionality always a bad thing? I certainly think that often tied aid or conditional aid is bad if it is, for instance, tied to the linked goods and services of donor countries, because that often means it isn't the best kind of aid that can be given. But we have to grasp the nettle here. Surely things like sustainability and human rights observance do seem generally to be a good thing. And in many aid programs now, like certainly the aid programs under the Labour government a few years ago in Britain, were based on what were called partnership agreements. But the fact of the matter is that the British government would not enter into a partnership agreement with a poorer country unless that poorer country signed up to certain universal standards. The projects that we were supporting were sustainable, there was human rights observance, some financial transparency, and some commitment to some kind of democracy. Now, this is a controversial area, but all I'm suggesting to you is that maybe some forms of sustainability are good and some forms of conditionality are good and some forms of conditionality are not so good. I remember once going to a seminar a few years ago on conditionalities and made this point, and a Swedish commentator in the seminar said in a very deep Swedish voice, "Yes, there are good conditionalities as well as bad conditionalities." And I think that sort of summed it up. Anyway, this is really the end of this current lecture. What I've done is simply consider a number of arguments against aid and some of the ways in which those arguments can be responded to. In the next lecture, I'm going to look at the whole idea of development in a more general sort of way. Thank you.